Hi there, my name is Tim Young. I'm going to be speaking on the subject of biblical authenticity confirmed through archaeology. I'm a big fan of archaeology. I love reading about it. I love researching it. I'm also a big fan of the Bible. And I love it when they come together and you can support the things that are in the Bible with things that you find in the dirt. Of course, when you're going to read things, you're going to read some archaeologists that support the biblical record and some archaeologists that do not support the record. And there's a whole history. I want to go through some of that and just show you some examples of pros and cons of what's been said. And we're going to look at the different viewpoints that are therein. And then I want to look at three specific examples. I mean, there's tons of examples, but these are some of my most favorites of the last 30 to 40 years that have really been pushing back at what the skeptics have been, or the archaeologists that are skeptics, have been saying about the Bible. Now, when you think about it, archaeology is really the study of other people's garbage. You're digging through the dirt, you're finding things that have been discarded, things that have been lost, or things that sometimes have been concealed. And it's like a detective trying to put all this together. The modern science of archaeology is just a little over 100 years old, and it's really developed over the last century. But when you think about it, you have different layers of dirt that you go through, different layers of a tell or something like that, that the lower down you go, of course, the older it is. And you find things like pottery or pottery sherds, broken pottery. You find coins that would help you to date the different levels. You'd find scarabs, Egyptian scarabs. And you might even find some inscriptions that would help you, but those are few and far between. And so you really have to kind of piece these things together to get a good idea of the timing and what exactly is going on. It's not an easy thing, but how much can you really tell from that? It's surprisingly quite a bit. Plus, you also have some other scientific means of carbon-14 dating and those kind of things. You might find an olive pit that had been eaten at the time and discarded. You can take that, crush it up, and determine within a fair amount of accuracy of when the site is dated for. So, when biblical archaeology first started back in the early 1900s, it really developed and came to its full front but with a fellow named William F. Albright. And in 1933, he said this: "The excessive skepticism shown toward the Bible by important historical schools of the 18th and 19th centuries, certain phases which still appear periodically, has been progressively discredited. Discovery after discovery has established the accuracy of innumerable details and has brought increased recognition to the value of the Bible as a source of history." Now, as I was saying, this is a prominent archaeologist of the time. It's 1933, and he would hold this view for the rest of his life. He died in 1971, but as another example, this is what he said in 1956. "There can be no doubt that archaeology has confirmed the substantial historicity of Old Testament tradition." So there was quite a fan of the Bible there. He had a lot of different viewpoints that maybe you wouldn't agree to, but these quotes really show how he used the Bible in archaeology. And he inspired a lot of archaeologists in their work. Times have changed. Over the last 30 to 40 years, there's been a real change in scholars and their approach. Here is a very prominent archaeologist of the day, Israel Finkelstein, and you'll find him in all sorts of interviews, and he goes around on speaking tours, writes a lot, and is quite influential. And he said this in 2010. "I do think we are in a process of liberation from an antiquated reading of the biblical text. Some archaeologists still interpret the Bible very literally. We tend to give it a more sophisticated reading. This is not to say that the Bible has no history. It means that we need to look at the biblical material more carefully, in a more sophisticated way. I think you can probably tell by what he means by sophisticated is skeptical way. He has a whole different approach to the Bible than what had been used in the past. Now, there might be all sorts of different factors there, but that is how a majority of the scholarship approaches the Bible these days and approaches archaeology. He said this in his book, The Bible Unearthed, and this would be earlier, back in 2001. The historical saga contained in the Bible, from Abraham's encounter with God and his journey to Canaan, to Moses' deliverance of the children of Israel from bondage, to the rise and fall of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, was not a miraculous revelation, but a brilliant product of the human imagination. Now that's quite startling and quite different. Now, I'll tell you who has the real imagination. It's Israel Finkelstein. And he's come up with some elaborate kind of theories about how the Bible is very fraudulent. He thinks it's just a lot of propaganda that was developed around the time of Josiah or later to kind of bolster up the smaller kingdom of Judah, Israel being the more influential one. Of course, that's not how the Bible presents history at all. And so you can see here two different viewpoints. And over the last 30 years, they've been labeled. The skeptics of the Bible have been called biblical minimalists, is that they minimalize the Bible's impact. They say that it is a political propaganda tool, that it's myth, that it was developed to establish Israel. It was developed in the times of the exile, years and years and years afterwards. Well, I'm a firm biblical believer, and so I am a biblical maximalist. And there are archaeologists who are biblical maximalists, and we'll be looking at a few of those. These two different viewpoints are clashing right now. You can also think of them this way, that one view is guilty until proven innocent, that is, the Bible's guilty until proven innocent, versus the Bible is innocent until proven guilty. And so how we approach it is very instrumental. Another way to look at it is absence of evidence is evidence of absence. Because basically when you're in the study of archaeology and you haven't found anything that correlates with the Bible, you then develop a skeptical viewpoint and you see absence of evidence is evidence of absence. You can think about that one for a little while. But the corollary to that would be absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So just because you didn't find anything doesn't mean that it's wrong or it didn't happen. So it's a little bit harder to kind of disprove that. But the axiom here, the second one, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, is a common logical axiom that is held and should be held in this case. Okay, with that background in mind, we're now going to take a look at three different examples, recent biblical archaeology examples, and we're going to put these to the test and see if the biblical minimalists are really doing fairly with the biblical text. The first one is called the Silver Scrolls at the tombs of Ketef Hinnom. The third one will be an altar that was found on Mount Ebal. And the third one is the large stone structure that has been discovered in the city of Jerusalem, in the old city of David itself. So let's start with the first one, the Silver Scrolls at the tombs of Ketef Hinnom. Now, you might recognize that name Hinnom if you're a Bible reader. You can find it in the Old Testament. It's a valley that's outside of Jerusalem and would become eventually the word Gehenna in the New Testament. And there was a young archaeologist who decided that he was going to dig at some caves that were there. Ketef means shoulder. And here it is right here. If you look at this picture, there's this kind of little outcrop of rock. They've now built a church on top of it. But you can see there are holes in the rock, and these are tombs. And as they unearthed them, they could see these burial benches. You see right here in the picture what looks like headrests. And there was a repository underneath where they would put the bones later on. Here's a picture from the actual archaeological excavation. And you can see the dirt that's been removed. And these are some of the volunteers, young 13-year-old volunteers that were helping on the site, laying down in the place where the bodies would have lain. So as we go back to our earlier picture, you can see this hole that's underneath it, and the archaeologist was quite aware of this hole. He had looked inside of it and found nothing. And up to this point, they really hadn't found anything. I think they'd found a bead or something like that. And one of these young students that was volunteering, because it was such on a shoestring budget, this dig, was a very annoying 13-year-old boy. And the archaeologist just says, go over to that hole over there and just clean it up, because the photographers are coming along, and gave him a hammer and some other things. And so the boy was in there for a little while, and he comes back, and he's tugging at the archaeologist's sleeve again, and he goes, oh boy, and he turns around, and this boy is holding pieces, almost whole pieces of pottery in his hand. The archaeologist says, where did you get that? And the boy takes him back to this location, and what had happened was he had this hammer, and like any 13-year-old boy, he's kind of bored, so he was banging on the floor, and he unearthed this layer of artifacts. What had happened was the roof of the tomb had actually come down or collapsed on top of the floor and made it look like it was just a plain rock floor. And so in this chamber, they found more than 1,000 objects. There was objects of silver, arrowheads, gold, ivory, glass, bone, 150 precious stones. There was like 2 feet of accumulation and skeletal remains in this area. So for any archaeologist, this would be so exciting. So they immediately kind of sent all the kids home. They locked it under secrecy. They worked 24 hours around the clock. It was a very hard work in there, but they started taking things out by buckets, marking them, and all those kind of things. Now, inside of here, one of the most remarkable finds they found is this. There's 2 of them here, and they fit in the palm of your hand, and they're very small. The bigger one's about 1 inch. It's very kind of purplish colored object and looks like a cigarette butt. It's actually a scroll, and this scroll is made of pure silver. They say it's 99% silver and very delicate. And so as they looked at it, they says, oh boy, we want to unravel this. We want to see what's inside of this scroll, but it's so delicate. Would it fall apart? So it took them 3 years going different places to see different methods about how to unravel this. And they finally were able to very delicately unravel it. And there is just very delicately scratched on the silver were ancient Hebrew characters, Paleo Hebrew characters. They're so old. They really give a dating to this as very ancient. And the archaeologist must have been very excited, because one of the first things he recognized was in the English, these letters YHWH, which, if you're familiar with that, that's the divine name. That's what in our Bibles is translated as Lord. And so there were 2 of these that they found. One was even smaller. And the surprise was immense when they deciphered these, and you can see now on this slide some of the writing on them, and as they're unfurled, the writing on the verses on them from the Bible. And the one that was most pronounced was Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 through 26. And this is what it read.
Yahweh the Great, who keeps the covenant and graciousness towards those who love him and those who keep his commandments, the eternal, the blessed, more than any snare and more than evil, for redemption is in him, for Yahweh is our restorer and rock. May Yahweh bless you, and may he keep you. May Yahweh make his face shine. And then the second, the smaller one, said very similar kind of words. Now, you might recognize this is not straight from the Bible, but what this is a compilation of some ancient text. And the one that really stands out is this priestly benediction taken from Numbers chapter 6, 24 through 26. But there's also other parts of the Bible in there, notably from Deuteronomy 7, verse 9, which is also in Daniel chapter 9, verse 4, and Nehemiah 1, verse 5. The amazing thing about these scrolls is how ancient they are. You can tell by the writing and by other things that were found around the pottery and in the burial cave and those kind of things, that this is from the time of the prophet Jeremiah, before the time of the exile. And it is, if you're familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is 500 years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is the most ancient copy, the most ancient witness to the biblical texts that we now have. And so that's what is amazing about this, is it's pushing back our idea when these texts were around. What's even more amazing is how fine and delicate the writing was. It was just a hair length, the scratches that are on there. It took them computers and those kind of things to really be able to decipher what was there. How did they scratch into silver something so fine? Well, you know what? The answer is in the Bible itself. So we said this was from the time of the prophet Jeremiah. And when you go to Jeremiah chapter 17 and verse 1, this is what it says. The sin of Judah is written with a pen of iron, with a point of diamond. It is engraved on the tablet of their heart and on the horns of their altars. Isn't that amazing? They actually had pens that had diamond points on them and that makes sense. That was the tool that they used, and the Bible gives us the answer. So we have this as a remarkable witness to a very ancient text of the Bible being established at this time amongst the populace, and it was outside of Jerusalem. And there's another aspect to this, and the archaeologist who discovered these silver scrolls has this to say about it. For years, Bible scholars, divided between the maximalists and the minimalists, have been arguing about whether Jerusalem was really a grand city or just a forgotten little town whose reputation was built up through the ages. Each side would point to different biblical passages to buttress its case. Now we know that it was a major city, he said. So, just from these two tiny little scrolls, he comes to the conclusion that Jerusalem was what the Bible says it was, a major metropolitan area. And he comes at this because these tombs were way outside of Jerusalem in the Valley of Hinnom. They were significant tombs. The silver amulets that were found here really attest to some riches and those kind of things. And so you have to take that as an assumption that Jerusalem was significant based upon the burial practices outside of the city. Okay, our second example is found from an altar that was found in the middle of Israel in Mount Ebal. Now, this gentleman's name is Adam Zertal. He's a very interesting character. He was an engineer in the late 60s, early 70s, and was involved in the Yom Kippur War, was injured in that war, and spent a year in the hospital. And it's during that time that he thought, boy, I need to change of career, and he went back to school, took archaeology, and became schooled in the ways of archaeology in Israel itself. And you can see here that he is walking on crutches. The effects of his injury in the war were long-lasting,
and for his lifetime. And the amazing thing about it is that even though he was in this state, his major job in 1980 was to go out and do a survey of all the land of Manasseh, so the central part of Israel, and go by it step by step and do a survey of all the archaeological sites he could find, not determining what they were, but just determining where the sites were. And it's during this kind of survey that he stumbled upon a site in Mount Ebal that made him very curious. So he went back there and started excavating in the early 80s. And what he found there was a structure. It was kind of mysterious to him at first, and it was 1983 they were digging this up. He made some sketches of it, and here's the sketches of what he was finding. And as they went back to their tents one night, and they were talking to some of the locals about it, and he showed them the sketch. And one of the locals got very excited about it, and he ran out of the tent, went and got what was called his Mishnah, and he came back with this and showed it to Adam Zertal. And there was a picture in this book that looked exactly like what he had found. Now, in the Mishnah is a description of the altar that was in the Temple of Israel. Mishnah is a commentary on the Bible, Jewish commentary. Has a lot in it. In this case, the dimensions of this altar fit exactly what was found here on Mount Ebal. Not exactly, but very close to what it was. And so it made them realize that it was an altar. And it was already kind of leaning towards that way because they had found ashes, bones, in this area as well. And then they realized that from the Bible itself, there is a description of an altar, and it's from Joshua 8, verses 30 through 31. And in there it says, "Then Joshua built an altar unto the Lord God of Israel in Mount Ebal," as right at this location, "as Moses the servant of the Lord commanded the children of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of whole stones, over which no man hath lifted up any iron. And they offered thereon burnt offerings unto the Lord, and sacrificed peace offerings." So the amazing thing is that as they were excavating this site, they found burned animal bones of males. They were all kosher, so that means they were just goats, lambs, calves, kosher being anything that the Israelites would offer. And they were very young animals, and it fit in with this pattern of Israelite sacrifice, because some of the detractors of the find were saying, "Oh, it's a cultic site, but it's more than likely Canaanite." But everything about the site itself suggests that it was not, because they were kosher animals, males of a year old, that were burnt and were not eaten. In fact, in the site, it's quite an extensive site. As you can see from this picture, there was a wall around it. There were rooms, and in some of these areas they could find actually evidence of some of these sacrifices being eaten, which is what the Israelites did. Some were burnt offerings, and some were peace offerings that were eaten. It's quite an extensive site, and so some people saying, "Well, it's not an altar, it must be a watchtower." And Adam would say, no. The walls are very low. They were not meant for a defense. All of the ashes around the site and everything indicate that this is a significant altar. It was made of unhewn stones, just as the Bible describes it. In fact, as you look at the picture of the altar, you find that there's a ramp leading up to it, which again is a description given of altars in the Old Testament that Israel would build, because God told them not to go up by steps lest they show their nakedness. So there was a ramp for the priest to go up. So everything here is an altar on Mount Ebal that fits the description given in the Old Testament, both in Deuteronomy and in Joshua. Now, to cement this, of course, you have all these bones and things, and
you can do carbon-14 dating, and the dating of this time was confirmed to be around 1200 BCE, precisely the time of Joshua's conquest. And the potsherds around the area date to that time. Everything is pointing this to an early Iron Age 1 time period, to the time when the Bible says that the Israelites came into the land. On top of that, they found 2 Egyptian scarabs, and these can be used for dating. There's a little bit of controversy about that, but they point to the reigns of pharaohs, and these were found right at this site, and they too indicate this time period. One is dated to the time of Ramesses II, which is suspected to be the pharaoh of the Exodus. The other is identified, it has on it the king who commands many archers, which is identified with Pharaoh Thutmosis III. He was a pharaoh that reigned earlier but was revered by Ramesses II, and so this scarab also seems to be issued in memory of that emperor. So everything points to the time that we suspect that this is Joshua's altar. Well, what do the biblical minimalists say about this? Is this altar? Well, here's Israel Finkelstein again saying there's definitely an Iron 1 site there, and there may even be evidence for cultic activity, but I don't think you can take the book of Joshua and use it as a guidebook to the architectural landscape. Joshua was put in writing much later than the events it describes and is full of ideologies related to the needs of the writers. So that's what he had to say about it, and as you can see, he's saying, well, you just can't take Joshua and say that this is this altar, even though all of the facts and evidence around that site really kind of indicate that this is that altar. So is there a preconceived idea here? Is there bias that is just saying, not even looking at the facts, and not even, because he's already determined that the Bible was written much later, even though here are the facts on the ground that are saying otherwise. Here's another one of the biblical minimalists. His name is Lawrence Steger. He is a professor of archaeology of Israel at Harvard University. And he said this: if a sacrificial altar stood on Mount Ebal, its impact on our research is revolutionary. All of us have to go back to kindergarten. Well, nobody wants to go back to kindergarten, and it's really kind of quite telling that they don't want to be wrong. And so Adam Zertel was one of these scholars. He was one who really doubted the authenticity of the Bible. Didn't think it was anything to be used. So the question was asked of him, you changed your mind on this subject. You now think it's the altar of Joshua. And he said this. He said, at that time, I was under the influence of the brainwashing I had got from the history and archaeology establishment that, influenced by biblical criticism, sees all the stories of the Tanakh that speak of the formation of the Jewish nation as complete myths. Therefore, I refused to accept the ideas that this was indeed Yahushua's altar. But to Adam Zertel's credit, what he had found, what he had detailed in his book on the subject, made him change his mind. And he became a believer of the Bible and of the living God that wrote this book. And he saw it as detailed and accurate and trustworthy to use as a source. Okay, and now for our third example, which I've saved the best for last. This one's called the large stone structure. Here we have another biblical minimalist. His name is Thomas L. Thompson. He's one of the more radical ones. Israel Finkelstein would be like a moderate minimalist. But Thomas Thompson had this to say: we do not have evidence for the existence of kings named Saul, David, or Solomon, nor do we have evidence for any temple at Jerusalem in this early period,
What we do know of Israel and Judah at the 10th century does not allow us to interpret this lack of evidence as a gap in our knowledge and information about the past, a result merely of the accidental nature of archaeology. There is neither room nor context nor artifact or archive that points to such historical realities in Palestine's 10th century. So those are some pretty bold words that he's said there about the Bible being a complete myth, like none of it actually ever happened. Now, when he said this, he was quite aware of the Tel Dan stele, which is a broken piece of rock that has an inscription on it. It was found in 1993 and 94 in excavations up in Tel Dan, the northern part of Israel. And it consisted of several fragments, and it was in Aramaic, and it's most probably from Hazael of Aram Damascus or Syria. And he was an important regional figure in the late 9th century BCE. And so this is an inscription that's not even Jewish or Israel. It's from a foreign source, but very ancient, and has our most oldest reference to King David. And it boasts of victories over Omri, the king of Israel, and his ally, the king of the house of David. So this is a reference to David just a few hundred years after his existence. So isn't that great evidence? Well, there's been a lot of controversy around that, around the word here, and because it doesn't contain a divider, it's not really saying House of David and such like things. But most scholars accept it as genuine and a reference to the house of David. Be that as it may, the question here is, did David rule over a dynasty, a large kingdom? And so here's another archaeologist. Her name's Elat Mazar, and she had this to say. She comes from a little bit of a lineage of some famous archaeologists who worked in Jerusalem, and this is what she said. In 1995, not long before he passed away, I spoke with my grandfather, Professor Benjamin Mazar of Hebrew University, about my idea. I told him I thought there was a high likelihood of finding remains from King David's palace near Kenyon's Area H. Aside from the archaeological discoveries there, the site fit quite well with the notice in 2 Samuel 5, verse 17, which describes David in the city of David going down or descending from his residence to the citadel or fortress. So there's a couple of things to note here from what she's saying. She mentions Kenyon's Area H, and she's making reference to an earlier archaeologist named Kathleen Kenyon. You might recognize her name from some Jericho excavations that she did in the 1950s. She also did some excavations here at this site in Jerusalem, the old city of David, by what's called the stepstone structure. And she was looking for evidence of King David and of this palace, and she didn't find it. So she basically wrote in her findings, it's not here, don't bother looking, you won't find anything. But Dr. Mazar was not off-put by that. She was looking at other evidence, and the other evidence was her Bible. And she read in 2 Samuel 5, verse 17, this phrase, just this slight word, going down. And she pondered that. Just something just a little like that. So I thought, let's just turn to 2 Samuel 5, verses 6 through 8. If you just have your Bibles with you and open, you'll want to see this for yourself and to read it very carefully. And this is the history of David taking the city of Jerusalem for himself. So 2 Samuel 5, starting at verse 6. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem unto the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, which spake unto David, saying, Except thou take away the blind and the lame, thou shalt not come in hither, thinking, David cannot come in hither. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, the same is the city of David. And David said on that day, Whosoever getteth up to the gutter, and smiteth the Jebusites, and the lame, and the blind, that are hated of David's soul, he shall be chief and captain. Wherefore they said, The blind and the lame shall not come into the house. So here's a reference of David taking the stronghold. There's a fortress there, And he's going to take it over and name it the City of David. And I especially want you to notice whoever getteth up to the gutter. So there's some sort of tunnel or waterway that they're going to use to attack the fortress. And so we read on in verses 9 through 11, and verse 17, it says, "And David lived in the stronghold and called it the City of David. And David built the city all around from the Milo inward." Now that word Milo there it's been a mysterious one, but I just want you to pay attention to that, and I'll show you where that is. "And David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. And Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and cedar trees, also carpenters and masons, who built David a house. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, all the Philistines went up to search for David, but David heard of it and went down to the stronghold." So those are the words at the very end that Mazar was picking up on. Went down to the stronghold. Now, when we look at a picture of the city, artist's rendition of the time and as it is now, you'll see that it's built on a hill and it slopes downwards. And the highest point is this at the very top, where there was a threshing floor of Aruna. This is where the temple would be built in the future. But as you go down, you come to the city walls, and then you come to this fortress. And you'll notice right there is this kind of structure, this kind of retaining wall, it looks like, but it's stepped. It's like a ramp. And that is called the stepped stone structure. And it is built out of fill and those kind of things. And it's interesting that the very Hebrew word milo means the fill. So this seems to be that location, or what is being talked about at this place. And at the top, there's evidence of a wall, which seems to be the wall of the city or of David's fortress here. So he went down. So the palace that he built would have had to been built more up the hillside, just outside the city walls. And that's what she was suspecting. So that's where she started looking. Now here's another picture, a little bit different view, an aerial view, and you can see the stepstone structure there on the left-hand side, and to the right is the excavations where she started, thought that it might be, and so she started digging there. And as she went down, she went through the different layers that archaeologists do, going through the Roman period and downwards and downwards, finding some interesting things. But as she got down to this time period where this great palace or King David's house should be, she started unearthing major walls and room after room after room. And so here's a picture of her standing on the edge of what she found and she dug up. And you can see the large walls and the stones that are there. And here's another picture showing it's quite intricate, even archways in the stonework there. This particular picture I wanted to show because it's actually built right on the bedrock. It's right down to the foundations. So there's really nothing underneath it. And just get a perspective of some of these walls. Here's a picture with a person standing in one of these rooms. Here's another one where you can overlook the stepstone structure or the milo that looks down below towards the valley. You can see what a great vantage point and that would have been, and a great defense point. Now, in her findings, of course, you want some verification about dates and such like. So she has found things like carved ivory, cypress pottery. All of this shows that it was a very rich house, deserving of royalty. There were clay seals that even represent or depict people. These seals right here are particularly of Gedaliah, son of Pashur, and Jehukal, son of Shelemiah. Now, those two names are taken right from Jeremiah 38, verse 1. And there's been a lot of these seals found all over the area, indicating the importance of this site, indicating that from the time of David until many years afterwards, it was inhabited and used. She even found in her diggings a tunnel, or the gutter, it seems like, because it's a fissure in the rock behind the Milo that goes down and would have been a perfect place for somebody to go up and invade the city. This is an enormous stone structure. It's no wonder they call it the large stone structure. But the Professor Mazar is convinced that this is the palace of David. And everything for her points to that. The timing of the pottery, some of the carbon-14 dating that they've done, others have done that have put it off a little bit, but it's all of these things combined together with Phoenician capitals that are found because the king of Tyre built this house and so on. So here is evidence for something grand in Jerusalem during the time of King David. So what do the biblical minimalists say? And we'll go back to Israel Finkelstein. And this is what he says. Recent claims by an archaeologist working at the site regarding the supposed discovery of the palace of King David and the city wall built by King Solomon are based on literal, simplistic readings of the biblical text and are not supported by archaeological facts. The supposed palace features walls from different periods, none dating, as far as I can judge, from the 10th century BCE, and the Wall of Solomon cannot be considered a true fortification and cannot be dated as early as the 10th century BCE. He goes on in another time to say this about the site. The biblical text dominates this field operation, not archaeology. Had it not been for Mazar's literal reading of the biblical text, she never would have dated the remains to the 10th century BC with such confidence. Which to me, I say, well, she would have never found it in the first place if she wasn't literally reading the Bible. So take the clue. The Bible really is true. All of that is there. You can't minimalize it in any way. And Professor Mazar knows that. So she knows the kind of controversy that she's in. She knows the two sides. And this is what she says after all these years of archaeological excavation in the area. For years, there have been those who contended that there was no evidence of public construction in 10th century BCE Jerusalem. They claim that David and Solomon were not important rulers as described in the Bible. Now there is evidence of such construction, and those who minimize the importance of David and Solomon have to deal with the facts, because in an out-of-the-way and remote settlement, you would not have a structure like this. To build such a major structure, you needed strong central rule in Jerusalem at that time. It's nothing like what is described by the minimalists. So, in true science, you're going to take the facts, you're going to compare them with your sources, and they're going to be trustworthy or not. And all the things that they're finding really relate to the Bible being accurate. It is describing truth. What really happened? So Professor Mazar is more of a maximalist in her approach. And this is a lovely saying that she has. It was in this interview. The journalist recognized something. He saw something about her as he's talking to her. He says, alongside her laptop on a paper-strewn desk sits the most telling object, a heavily marked Bible. Like her grandfather and father before her, Mazar is a believer in the Bible's historical reliability. One of the many things I learned from my grandfather was how to relate to the biblical text, she says. Pore over it again and again, for it contains within it descriptions of genuine historical reality. She adds, I work with the Bible in one hand and the tools of excavation in the other. That's what biblical archaeologists do. The Bible is the most important historical source, and therefore deserves special attention. All I can say to that is, Amen. So, in conclusion, really, what have we found? Is the Bible a trustworthy source of history? Is the authenticity of it confirmed through archaeology? Is the viewpoint of William F. Albright correct that there can be no doubt that archaeology has confirmed the substantial historicity of Old Testament tradition? We've seen many modern scholars who have tried to say no, that the Bible is full of myth, that it's not accurate, that it's fraudulent, that it's mainly propaganda. Now, we've looked at only three examples, but they tell a witness that is in other places of archaeology that the Bible is trustworthy. We've seen the response of the skeptics, these archaeologists who do not believe it to be true. And have they dealt honestly with the things that have been found? So not all archaeologists today are that way. There are some that are maximalists. And we can turn to their work and we can see that what they found through archaeology really proves the Bible to be accurate, to be historically accurate, to be trustworthy, and therefore we can go on to see it as the Word of God and its truth and what it says in Spirit. Thank you very much.